Welcome to HFIG Talks, a podcast produced by the Human Factors Interest Group at the University of Toronto. HFIG is a student chapter of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society at U of T and consists of students, faculty, and local professionals who are interested in the field of human factors. My name is Jenny, and today my co-host Stacy and I will be interviewing our guest, Dr. Abigail Sellen, about their career in human factors. Dr. Sellen, thank you so much for joining us today. To start us off, could you introduce yourself to our listeners and share a bit about your educational background, your role at Microsoft, and your research interests?
Sure. Well, happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. So I am currently lab director for Microsoft Research based in Cambridge in the UK. My lab is sort of the European lab for Microsoft Research, so it covers Europe, but also Middle East and Africa. But in particular, I have a lab in Nairobi in Kenya and a couple of sites in Cambridge, and that's what I do. I lead the lab. In terms of my educational background, I started out at U of T, and I started out doing a psychology degree. You know, it's a really great psychology department, so it was a really good sort of foundation for my career. I then transitioned into human factors engineering for a master's degree. And then I went back to psychology and cognitive science. I did a PhD in cognitive science at UC San Diego with Don Norman, who is a psychologist. And that was a great department. There was a lot of machine learning was starting off then, and human-computer interaction and lots of other things. So that was my path educationally. And then from UC San Diego, I got an internship at Apple Computer for the summer, which got me into HCI, or human-computer interaction, and things sort of took off from there. After Apple, I went then to work for Xerox Europark, which was the European branch of Xerox PARC, for a few years, then Hewlett-Packard Labs in Bristol in the UK, and then Microsoft. And I've been here 21 years, which is a very long time. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell my career path.
Awesome. Yeah, you've kind of gotten a taste of everything in there.
Yeah.
I'm curious, you mentioned all of the different labs you're involved in right now. Does that require a lot of traveling?
Yes, it can do. I mean, two of my labs are in Cambridge, so that's not so bad. In fact, I'm at the one on the north end of town today, and then there's one next to the station at the south end of town. But of course, it's harder to get back and forth between Cambridge and Nairobi. So yeah, that does take some travel. But I love going to Nairobi because Kenya is a wonderful country.
Awesome. Yeah, and you mentioned your start in psychology, then transition to human factors. Could you tell us a bit more about what got you interested in psychology and the subsequent transition into human factors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it comes down to one person who was my stepfather, John Senders. You may have heard of him. He was a faculty member in human factors at U of T for many, many years. Sadly died in 2019 at the age of almost 99.
Wow.
Really one of the pioneers of human factors engineering, but he started off as a psychologist. In fact, he did his psychology degree at Harvard and studied with people like B.F. Skinner, knew all the great and the good in psychology. And so he encouraged me to get interested in psychology, but he was a mathematician as well, and I was pretty good at math. He really got me interested in modeling human behavior mathematically. You know, so we'd be sitting maybe by a pool, and he'd say, you can measure the frequency with which a mother has to look at a toddler getting closer and closer to the edge of a pool by, you know, how frequently they have to look based on the uncertainty of where that toddler is. Or we'd be standing in a bank in a queue, and he'd say, you could use queuing theory to model, you know, how often or what the mean interval is between somebody getting served in this queue, right? So he talked about mean wait time and number of servers, and he sort of taught me to think like that, and I thought that was actually pretty fascinating. So I started in psychology, but I did a lot of mathematics, and then got really interested in engineering and wanted to apply what I knew in psychology to real systems, and that's why I made the transition to human factors. It was very much kind of seeded by his excitement and passion for those areas.
Thank you so much for sharing. And building on that, we would love to dive into one of your current areas of focus now, human AI interaction. So when did you first begin exploring this field and what inspired this direction?
My interest in this has been fairly recent, I would say, really in the last 3 years since the kind of big disruption around large language models. When I started off doing cognitive science in the 1980s and early 90s, AI was not working very well. AI was a bit of a failed experiment. You know, we had things called expert systems back then, where the idea was that you try and get experts to articulate how they reason about things, and then you try and program it into a computer. And those things failed badly because, as we know from psychology, the more expert you get at something, the less well able you are to talk about it, right? So getting experts to talk about what they do is really, really hard. So those things never worked very well, and it made me very skeptical. It was called the AI winter back then. And then psychologists started to get involved in that whole field. People like John Anderson, Terry Sinofsky, Dave Rommelhart, Mike Jordan, people like that. They're studying psychology, started to, and Jeff Hinton, of course, you probably know, all came from a psychology background, and they were talking about neural networks and neurally inspired computing and coming up with ways of making it work, like through back propagation. So it started to work. And at that point, I got more interested in it, but I was still fairly skeptical. And then I fast forward to 2022, large language models just took off, went through the roof. And that's when, my whole company was pivoting, and I got involved in that as a kind of social scientist engineer. Yeah, so fairly recent. I think up till then, my career has looked at many different kinds of technologies, right? Video conferencing, input devices, the web, mobile devices. The thing about industrial research is that you're always trying to stay one step ahead of the game and see what's coming down the line. And so we would normally work on those things, right? And that's how things have played out. So I would say, yeah, the whole human AI thing has been fairly recent.
Always interesting to me, or about with human factors, just the difference in perspectives or the combination of perspectives and blending psychology with engineering and, as you mentioned, math. And then also building on what you just mentioned about looking down the line and kind of anticipating things in industrial engineering. I recently read your paper with Eric Horvitz on the rise of the AI co-pilot lessons for design from aviation and beyond. And in this paper, a key component was building on Bainbridge's 1983 paper, Ironies of Automation. So with the increasing speed of innovation in society today, what are your thoughts on the idea that human factors problems that existed 40 years ago still are relevant and exist today?
Actually, this came about because Eric is chief scientist at Microsoft, and we talk a lot, and he has a background in human factors engineering too. And we were talking about people using Copilot, which is Microsoft's AI product, right? And I said, it's really interesting how Copilot brings us back to all the aviation work in human factors engineering that's been going on for decades, right? Like there's a whole field around this. Everything we've learned in human factors about how pilots can become over-reliant on autopilot, how they need to be trained in simulators, all of the things that Lizanne Bainbridge said in her amazing seminal paper, which, by the way, I think she wrote in like 2 days or something. She was amazed.
Wow.
She was amazed at how it caught on. But it is a great paper. And all of those principles and conundrums that she talked about and the ironies really apply to the AI space now. And so we said, well, we should really write about this. And so that's why we put that little piece together. But back to the kind of bigger point, I mean, human factors engineering has been looking at things like complex systems, why people make errors, how do you design systems to mitigate against errors, training, what are the best ways of training people, levels of skill, what happens to people when they become more skilled or less skilled, comparing novices to experts. But the main thing is about learning about how human operators, it's usually human operators, not users, interact with complex systems. Work in human factors has been doing that for decades, and it just seems crazy that we weren't falling back on that knowledge. I mean, Jonathan Gruden is somebody who's written about how human-computer interaction, HCI, human factors engineering, have diverged as fields. We don't tend to read across those boundaries. which doesn't make any sense, right? Because a lot of what we're looking at is the same. I think it's because human factors emerged as a kind of field for non-discretionary use of technology, people who had to operate nuclear power plants, people who had to fly planes, medics who were doing operations, whereas HCI comes from, people having fun with personal computers and doing games and things, but they were choosing to use those tools, and less so, obviously, when personal computers became, critical for work. But they started off on different paths, right? And they didn't merge very much. And we have so much to learn from each other. When I think about applying what we know from human factors engineering now to AI, it totally makes sense. I think some of the big differences in what AI is presenting us with is much more complexity, a much faster moving field. It's moving faster than any technology I've ever known, and something that has agency, right? We're talking about technologies which more and more we're talking about agents and agency. And so it's different, but it doesn't mean that what we've learned for all those decades doesn't apply. In fact, I think a lot of it applies. So yeah, we need to learn from each other. We need to read across those boundaries, is my feeling about it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think that words are really important in shaping how people perceive tools like AI. And I personally found the AI co-pilot metaphor in your paper to be a very helpful framework of thinking about things. And it's very striking how Bainbridge's work still definitely resonate in this landscape. And along with Bainbridge's work, are there any other seminal papers or researchers whose work you find yourself kind of referring back to time and time again?
Yeah, so I'll name a couple. One researcher who I think made a huge difference to my thinking about human-machine interaction is Jens Rasmussen. And so, he came up with this skills, rules, knowledge framework for how we think about skill. So people, as they become more and more skilled and experts, interact with machines in a specific routinized way where they're not paying much attention. The knowledge-based at the other end of the continuum is when people are having to, from first principles, think about what they're interacting with and how it works. And in the middle, there's this rules-based thing, like if you see the situation, then you should do this, right? It's procedural. That's how a lot of nuclear power plant operators are trained. So that there's these three levels of skill, which I've always found extremely useful when you think about how people interact with complex systems. Now, he's no longer with us either, which is sad for us because I think he had a lot more to contribute. A lot of people in HCI, for example, don't know that framework. And in psychology too. So they might talk about, like Danny Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 thinking, but they don't have the one in the middle, which is the rule-based thinking. So they're missing something there, I think. So Jens Rasmussen would be one. Another person, again, who I'm talking about a lot of people who are no longer with us, but James Reason, who has just passed away recently, his work on human error and in system design has been like a center point for me, a focus for me, especially when I was doing my PhD on error detection. I talked with him a lot about human error, what causes it, how do you design systems to help you detect human error and help mitigate in system design. He was a genius at that, and he worked with a lot of different industries, such as the aviation industry, nuclear power plant industry, and other control systems. And so he was hugely influential, and his writing still is. And also Neville Murray. So Neville Murray was my master's advisor when I did human factors. Was a great professor, but also a lot of his writing about all kinds of topics, especially mental workload. Neville Murray, professor at U of T for many, many decades, is, I think, a great person to read about and for their material and to read what he's written on, especially on topics like mental workload. So there's three for you.
Thanks. Those are great references. And also, I had never thought about it. Like my background is also in psychology, so I learned about System 1 and System 2 thinking, and then I learned about the SRK model, but never really connected the two in my mind. So that's a great parallel I'll keep in mind. So now looking forward, what role does human factors have to play in supporting human AI interaction, and what are some key areas of research we should pay attention to?
Some of the things I've already mentioned, but let me try and summarize again. I think that, yes, we have decades of work in looking at how human operators interact with complex systems. So I would say lots of lessons to be learned about how do we shape the partnership between a human and a machine, whether that's an AI system or any other kind of complex technology. We have great work by people like Tom Sheridan, for example, on the role of automation and how we think about automation in relation to people. All the work on over-reliance and over-automation, and we write it, Eric and I wrote about in that paper, the perils of over-automation. This is what Lizanne Bainbridge talked about too, right? If you become too reliant, then what happens when things fall apart? People lose those skills and capabilities, and they can't troubleshoot when they need to, right? So maybe we need to worry about that with AI systems. In fact, I think we do need to worry about that with AI systems, and we need to make sure that we involve humans in the loop, just so that they're involved and they know what's going on, but also if they need to troubleshoot, and also to make those systems usable but fulfilling for people, that they're doing the stuff so humans are doing the things that make them feel fulfilled, make work meaningful, take advantage of things that humans are good at, and then allocating the roles of the machine to the things that machines are good at, because machine intelligence and human intelligence are very different, right? Fault diagnosis is another topic that human factors engineering has written about a lot. I'm thinking here of work by, for example, Penny Sanderson, designing systems for to help people diagnose faults and to troubleshoot. And then human error, another one. I mean, we have like decades of work in looking at safety and reliability, frameworks for doing that, tools for doing that, taking whole ecosystems of technology and figuring out where things might go wrong, and trying to predict those and mitigate against them. Eric Holnagel's work in that area on reliability and safety and risk analysis is one name that pops into mind. Also, a lot of work in the medical area in human factors, looking at errors in medicine, in clinical settings, really relevant. So there's loads, but I could go on, but there's a few examples. So I think there's a whole lot that we can do and a lot that the field can contribute.
Thank you. That's a really helpful framing of kind of where human factors fits into the AI conversation. And we're curious, in your current role as a distinguished scientist at Microsoft, what has been one of the most surprising or interesting insights that you've encountered so far?
Well, lots over the years. I'd say recently, the disruption of large language models and what they're capable of, and how quickly that they're developing new capabilities, and the speed of it is just amazing and exciting and scary all at the same time. It's like being on a roller coaster. And so when you work in big tech and you're sort of at the forefront of this, I kind of feel like I'm hanging on with my fingernails sometimes. It's just changing so fast. I would say that's surprising and scary and exciting all at the same time.
Hopefully by the end you can like clap after the roller coaster.
Yes, exactly. Take a breather.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of going back to, you mentioned your some of the work that you've done before you shifted to AI. I'm just curious, I think you mentioned video conferencing, either that specific research area or any other research focus that you've had in the past, if there's anything that really stuck with you, or perhaps you would like to revisit with a new perspective moving forward.
Well, so video conferencing is an interesting one, right? Because during the pandemic, it just became such a hot topic for good reason, right? And yet I'd been looking at it in the sort of early 90s. And in fact, I was in the computer science department for doing a postdoc at U of T with Bill Buxton in the early 90s. And we built a media space back then. You put cameras and microphones and speakers and monitors in everybody's office. And we were playing around a lot with different ways of connecting people and kind of looking at how speech patterns were different, talking over video, and looking at some of the problems of, why people found it so tiring and why it wasn't like being face to face. And so we did a lot of studies around that. And so when the pandemic hit, all of these publications started bubbling back up. People started asking the same questions that we had asked, years before. So we were able to kind of talk about it right away because we we'd done a lot of the work. The problem was trying to get changes made to the technology. I would argue that what we're doing right now, looking at each other on a screen with split screen, is not that much different from what we had all those years ago. I think some things are better. Some of the user experiences are better. There's more flexibility over how you can use them, record, transcribe. You can choose different views. You can spotlight people. The sound is better. The lag is mostly gone. So some things are better, but we still haven't solved a lot of the problems that we set out to solve. So that was an interesting retrospective when that all happened.
Did you ever imagine, whenever you were doing that research on video conferencing, that you'd now be spending a good portion of your day talking to others on the computer?
No, not
Yeah.
at all. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an amazing tool, right? And the fact that we can be talking right now over thousands of miles apart is great. But it's still tiring, and it's still not like being together in the same room. And, a lot of those fundamental problems still exist. And there's some problems that are just really, really hard to crack with technology and may never be solvable with technology. I kind of think sometimes we have to admit that.
Could I ask if you had specific problems that you had in mind that you kind of referenced to just now?
Yeah, so one of the fundamental problems with video conferencing technology is knowing how you are perceived by others. So can you tell right now which one of you I'm looking at? No. So you don't know how I'm seeing you or hearing you, right? And actually, Bill and I, back then, we did make a system where people were physically separated on the desktop, on your physical desktop. So when you did head turning, you could tell who was looking at whom when. And that solution worked really well. And we actually proposed it to some tech companies, but it's very hardware intensive. So it was hard to get people to invest in that idea. But that's one of the fundamental problems, is not knowing how you're heard or how you're seen. And we have not cracked that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, or even if it had come to my mind before that, I'm not sure where that person is looking. I didn't think of distinguishing between the different panels in the screen or anything like that. That's cool.
And it does matter in a lot of discussion, right? So, if we were in the same room and I turned to look at you, Stacey, you might take that as a cue for it's your turn to say something. But we don't have that right now. I'd have to name you, or I'd have to somehow, I can't even point to you right now.
Where am I?
Yeah, and that makes me curious. Do you have any insights that you might want to share with us on what might be those fundamental problems that's hard to crack, or that you think is impossible to crack in the realm of human AI interaction?
I think the companionship thing is the need for human connection is something that I hope AI never tries to replace. I mean, I understand that, there are attempts to build things which will help, like people who are maybe housebound or who find it easier to talk to a machine than a person. That there are uses for that, but I hope that we never get to the point where we just replace human connection for all the good reasons why we want human connection. And we saw this during the pandemic, that people really need human connection. So that's one area that I don't think we ever should crack, one problem we should never try to solve. And I think about what's happening. People have talked about education and having AI tutors instead of teachers. Well, that kind of ignores the fact that teachers do a lot of other things, like, they might have a friendship or a relationship with a student where they're teaching them, but they're also giving them emotional support, So I think we don't want to design humans out of the loop for a lot of these important things that we might miss if we don't think about actually what is human connection doing for us.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, and definitely something to keep in mind as human factors researchers moving forward. Pivoting a little bit from what we don't want to research or problem solve, are there any areas of research that you're really excited to pursue at the moment or see yourself pursuing in the future?
Yeah, sure. So the one that really interests me at the moment is thinking about what AI's impact is on human cognition and metacognition. When we think about having AI help us write something or help us summarize something we want to comprehend, or doing some of the thinking for us. There are clear indications from research that people can do tasks faster with AI. But my worry is if we just look at how fast people can do things and what the task outcome is, what kind of artifact do they produce, we're not looking at what is the impact on people. We're not looking at what's the impact on learning, on memory, on perception, on critical thinking, on metacognition, on creativity. So we need to be looking, and as psychologists and human factors engineer, we have the tools to look at what's actually happening to people's thinking capabilities, right? So we saw with the rise of the internet, there's a lot of evidence for how younger generations, and actually all of us, have changed our attentional capabilities. We find it really hard to pay attention to one thing now. I watch my kids watching TV or something. They've got at least 2 screens going. And I do that now too. We also know there's neurological evidence to show that the brain is actually changing because of that. So what's happening when AI starts to do these things for us? So we're actually running a bunch of studies where we have one study where we're looking at people writing something with AI, totally getting AI to write something versus writing something themselves. And then we've got a middle condition where they write an outline of what they want to write, and then AI fills it in. And what we don't tell them is a few days later, we test their memory for what they wrote. You would expect the people who do the writing themselves have a better retention of the material, and the people who totally give it over to AI don't remember very much, right? So that's a kind of an obvious one. But the question for me is what happens to new generations of students who are coming through who never completely pick up those writing skills because they're depending on AI too much. Like, what's going to happen? Those skills and capabilities will go away. Do we care? I don't know. First of all, do we care? When the calculator came out, there was a lot of, angst about students won't know how to do math anymore. Well, it turns out you do need basic math skills to use a calculator. If you put something in, you need to be able to look at it and say, does that look about right, or did I make a mistake? Just like with writing there and all those other literacy skills, numeracy skills, computational thinking, there are certain things that we need to know in order to use the technology. So I'm very interested in this whole area of what's AI's short-term impact and long-term impact on human cognition.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's reminding me of thinking of AI as a tool and the impact on the brain and neural developments. I remember this one course I took, and it had a focus on evolution, and talked about how the development of tools in evolution did change the human brain. So it's almost like thousands of years later, we're seeing it happen again.
Yeah, and there's the classic study of London taxi drivers. You may have heard this one in psychology, where taxi drivers used to have to learn something called the knowledge, and this was intensive training and years of experience learning how to get around the streets of London. And it actually, if you did brain scans of taxi drivers who had the knowledge, areas of the brain were different from people who didn't have it. It actually changes the neurological patterns of activity in the brain. And so these things can have a very short-term effect, right? And now taxi drivers in London, they just put the sat nav on. They just put the GPS on. If you go to London, you get in a taxi cab with one of the older guys, they'll talk about the fact that they have the knowledge. They don't need this GPS, they've got the knowledge.
That makes me curious if you have any perhaps personal strategies or way of approaching the use of AI. So you're still leveraging and making use of the powerful AI tools, but also at the same time continuing to develop and foster your skills like critical thinking.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked, because we actually are working on that very topic. One of the things we're working on is designing new experiences where the AI might interject and kind of provoke you into thinking. Advet Sarkar, who's one of the people in my team, has written an article called AI as Provocateur. And he's playing around with the idea that AI might actually come in and provoke you into thinking about something. And so I think the challenge is coming up with AI experiences where you just want to get something done. You don't want the AI questioning you or stopping you or making you think. You just want to do it, versus using it in ways that are going to make you think and help you think. we're at the very early stages of trying to figure out how do you design those experiences where AI helps you think, and maybe even without you knowing it, they're helping you. And so we don't know what all the answers are right now, but there are ways in which there are guidelines that we believe that one can put together that help product designers design tools in such a way to deepen people's thinking capabilities rather than to undermine them, which I think we're in danger of doing if we don't think about this.
It's really interesting and exciting to hear where the field is headed. So thank you for sharing that. And as a final question, we would love to ask, what advice would you give to our listeners who are interested in pursuing research in human AI interaction?
Well, two things. Okay, so first of all, I mentioned it earlier, but read across fields. Don't just read the human factors engineering stuff, read the HCI work, read philosophy, read psychology, anthropology, whatever you can, really. And the more multidisciplinary you can be, I think the better off you're going to be. Because AI is a field that crosses boundaries where we need to be human-centric. We need everybody kind of pitching in and making sure we develop these technologies in the best way we can. And then the second thing I would say is use AI in your everyday work. Use it several times a day. Use it at work and at play, right? Because you will quickly learn what it does well and doesn't do well. And you will never learn that unless you're hands-on with it. So every time you get a chance, say, well, I could use Copilot for that, or I could, use whatever model or whatever tool for that. Try it out, because you'll find out some really interesting things it does well. And then you'll find out there are some things you really wish it would do well, but it's not doing very well right now. And then you might try it again in 6 months to be totally different. Live with it, because all of us are living with it now, and all of us are going to be increasingly living with it. And you need to be ahead of the curve and learn what the limits are.
Thank you so much for that insight. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. Dr. Sellen, thank you again so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Your reflections on both the foundational and emerging elements of human factors and human AI interaction have been incredibly insightful and valuable. And we know our listeners will take a lot away from this conversation as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That was really fun. And I'm looking at both of you now. So
yeah.
Thank
you. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of HFIG Talks. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast. We'll be back soon with more conversations. Until then, take care.